Alright, so let's do a quick review of the spinal cord and the major somatosensory ascending systems taking information from the periphery up to the cortex. And we're going to throw in a little bit of the descending system, the lateral corticospinal tract, which is the main motor tract that we care about in medical neuroscience. So first things first, again, I'm not going to inflict my art on you here, so we've already drawn this out. So if we've got pain and temperature information, it's coming into the spinal nerve from free nerve endings out in the periphery, heads into the posterior root, cell body is located therein, comes across, gets to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. At that point, it's going to, we'll leave it the same color, red for pain and temperature. It's going to synapse with its second order cell body right there. And that guy's going to decussate, cross, head over to the anterolateral tract. And it's already got several axons from whatever level happens to be below here coming through there. This guy joins the crowd, ascends to reach the BPL thalamus. I'm going to take vibration, proprioception, and fine touch, and those axons coming from things like Pacinian corpuscles, Meissner's corpuscles, etc., are going to join from the peripheral nerve into the spinal nerve, through the posterior root, cell body, once again located in the DRG, posterior root ganglion, into the posterior root. And these guys are going to ascend in the dorsal columns, and they're going to work those in here. So here we've got a dorsal column collection of cells closer to the midline. This is the fasciculus gracilis. The one that's a little lateral to it is the fasciculus cuneatus. And if we're below T5, we don't have a fasciculus cuneatus. We only get that after we've gone above about T5. So from the lower limb, jumps into fasciculus gracilis alongside all the other axons that are coming from the levels below. It's above T5, particularly in the upper limbs. It jumps onto fasciculus cuneatus and joins any axons that happen to be there already. Now, we haven't discussed this in detail, but most of you will probably have covered some of this in terms of looking at motor activity. Motor activity also decussates, but instead of going from the periphery up, it's coming from the cortex down. And the tract it travels in is located in the lateral white matter of the spinal cord. It's called the lateral corticospinal tract. Name pretty much tells you what it's going to do. And it's continuing through, all the way down throughout the spinal cord, and as it reaches the level where it's going to innervate lower motor neurons, it peels the axons off. They head into the anterior part of the gray matter of the spinal cord, anterior or ventral horn, synapse with the lower motor neuron, and that guy heads out the anterior root, spinal nerve, and then goes to muscle. Not a red Pacinian corpuscle, it's muscle. I swear. Right there. And if we draw these guys in, remember they're symmetrical. They're on both sides. There's lateral corticospinal in green, dorsal column, medial lemniscal system in purple, fasciculus gracilis, and the more laterally, fasciculus cuneatus, and the anterolateral system hanging out at every level of the spinal cord right here, receiving axons from the contralateral side. So that's the quick summary of what's going on and how all these tracts are traveling. What we're going to do now is see what happens with certain spinal cord injuries and how it affects all of those guys. Alright, so take one last look at this label right here, and we're going to just ease it out of the way and throw in somebody who is unlabeled. And now we're going to see if we can figure out how different spinal cord injuries compromise the different systems that we've been studying. So first things first, if I very perversely decide to just start lesioning this person's central nervous system in various places to make a point, one place I might start is right here, spinal nerve. That'll be our first spot. A lesion right there is going to result in motor and sensory loss at that spinal level. Which makes sense because the motor nerves can't get out, the sensory nerves can't get in, and that's about it. Let's say I cause a lesion right here. What's going to happen then? Motor's coming out this way. It's unaffected. Sensory coming back in, however, is knocked out. So sensory and all sensory loss occurs when you have damage to any part of the posterior root right there. But if it's only that particular root, it's only going to be that level. The other spinal levels will be just fine if the damage is isolated to that one spot. And conversely, shouldn't be much of a surprise, if I have damage right there at the anterior root, that's going to knock out all motor activity at that particular level. And if you've covered upper versus lower motor neuron signs yet, this would be a lower motor neuron loss and would cause flaccid paralysis of any of the muscles innervated by that particular nerve. Alright, so that's fairly straightforward. Now let's get a little more sophisticated. We're going to go into the spinal cord, and let's just say we've lesioned one entire side of the dorsal column right here. We've, at one level, not the entire length of the spinal cord, but at one level, we've created a massive lesion right there. What's going to be lost? Well, motor's fine. It's coming down, synapsing, heading out. Anterolateral system coming in, synapses here, as long as the damage doesn't extend into the gray matter, it's also fine. But any info that's trying to make it up through the dorsal columns is now going to be lost. And that's going to result in vibration, proprioception, fine touch losses on the ipsilateral side. And that is important. Ipsilateral, because it's sensory and it hasn't decussated yet. So any lesion here affects your perception of information coming from that side. And what's even more important, potentially, than that, is it's not just wiping out the one level. If you've got damage here, you can't get these other axons that are trying to get upward past the blockage. Now, up above the lesion, they're going to be just fine. So you'll have an area where you've got vibration, proprioception, and fine touch losses on the ipsilateral side at all levels below the lesion. Now we're assuming that this has wiped out all of the dorsal column medial lemniscal system on this particular side, but nothing else. That's a little bit of a simplification from reality, but it makes sense when you're trying to learn it. Let's move over to here, and let's wipe out the anterolateral system at the same level. That'll be the converse. We're going to have just fine vibration, proprioception, and fine touch, but we're going to have a loss of the pain and temperature sensation at that level. But here's the tricky thing. It's not on the same side. If it's coming in from here, it's synapsing and heading over this way. So we're actually losing, by damaging this side of the spinal cord, we're losing the contralateral input. So pain and temperature losses from the contra, or opposite, lateral side. And just as before, if we've got info below there, a level below this lesion, it hits that lesion and is probably not going to be able to get past it. So you've got it affecting all levels below the lesion. Now this system is a little bit tricky in that it ascends just a little bit as it comes in. It's not going to be 100% at the same level, but it's pretty close. Any info that joins the anterolateral system above the lesion is just fine. So you're going to be able to have a very real way of determining where the lesion in the spinal cord is by doing a good neurologic exam. Close to the end. Let's wipe out the lateral corticospinal tract. Motor is coming down. So we've wiped out the lateral corticospinal tract. That is going to result in motor loss. And you can be asking whether it's ipsi or contralateral. Well, it's ipsi, because these guys are going to head out here to the same side and then head out, upper motor neurons to lower motor neurons, and then out the spinal nerve. So damage here affects the same side. Now these guys decussated way up in the brainstem, so that's been long done. So it's going to have motor loss, and if it's wiped out this whole area, it's wiped out all the levels below the lesion. Alright, so that takes us through all of those guys individually. Now let's look at what's referred to as a fairly common spinal injury, largely because penetrating trauma that hits the spinal cord is often deflected by the spinous processes of the vertebra, and you can actually wind up with more frequency than you'd probably imagine penetrating trauma that affects one entire half of the spinal cord. So you've received damage to just the one side, and again, we're going to simplify it and assume that the damage affects everything on this side and absolutely nothing on the opposite side. Now, is that reality? No, but it's a nice simplification so that we can learn what the heck we're talking about. So that's going to be our 7th lesion here. And that is referred to as a Brown-Séquard syndrome. And it's going to seem a little overwhelming. But if we break it down, we wiped out the lateral corticospinal tract. So we've got loss of motor on the ipsilateral side, and that's going to cause upper motor neuron signs. So spastic activity of the levels below the lesion, fascicular, or kind of just rigidity, hyperreflexia is going to result from that, upper motor neuron signs. We wiped out the dorsal column medial lemniscal system. So we've got sensory loss of vibration, proprioception, fine touch, and that is going to be, again, because it hasn't decussated yet, ipsilateral. We've wiped out anterolateral tract right here, but remember, it decussated from the opposite side before joining this tract. So we're going to have sensory loss of pain and temperature from the contralateral side. So that's not too hard. The tricky part about Brown-Séquard, sorry, let's move that up a little, is that not only have we lost the white matter tracts, but we've also lost the gray matter. So in addition to these guys, we're going to have, at the single level affected here, wiped out the anterior horn of the spinal cord. So we're going to have, at one level, at the affected, pardon me, getting a little crammed for space here, level, lower motor neuron signs, but only at that damaged level. We're going to have wiped out the dorsal horn of the spinal cord on that side. And so we're also going to have, ready for it, ipsilateral loss of the anterolateral system, but only at that level. It's fine below there and can send axons to the opposite side without trouble. So that is what gets a little tricky about Brown-Séquard syndrome, but if you know your spinal cord anatomy and you know your tracts, you can break it all down and figure it out, especially in the context of a question where they have to give you a list of symptoms that make some coherent sense. All right, I hope this has been helpful, and happy studying.